We are recording and I'm just going to get into it, and I am going to hope and assume my mic is working. I'm going to light some sage here to just party started, because what I want to talk about today is a super interesting topic, and a topic that I love that people are getting more and more into, which is the topic of self-discovery, inner self, inner child. And this is a topic that even science is into, right? There's all kinds of psychotherapies that have developed, we've developed AI in order to, see if we can mimic human consciousness. It's so interesting. And I love that, for as industrious as humanity is in exploring of everything in our environment, like the real final frontier is within. Let's get into it. Welcome, everybody. I'm Kat, and this is Vibrational You, where we take certain common spiritual concepts and practices and dig into them a little bit more in depth on a vibrational level to talk about whether or not these practices work well for you vibrationally and how you're really interpreting them. And today we're going to dig into self. What I'm hoping to do with this video is to just go ahead and take a little bit of deep dive into the different layers of self, and looking at like just how big and complex and diverse a topic this really is. I think any conversation about self as a concept really has to start with who we are as physically focused personalities. This is sometimes it's referred to as the ego. I'm going to try not to refer to it that way, just because I think there's a lot of negative vibration out there right now surrounding the ego self, as in conversations like, oh, your ego is just trying to scare you, or that's just the fear from your ego self, ignore that. And even the word ego or egotistical has negative connotations. So I'm just going to refer to it as the physically focused self, or a physical self-focus point, because that's really all it is it's the portions of self that are focused in physical reality and operating within that physical reality. And it's not negative or bad, it's like critical in order for you to be a physically focused human. I think if we examine even just that aspect of self, we realize that self is a super fluid concept. We're really a set of kind of base personality traits that are loosely held together by unifying factors, those unifying factors being how we think of ourselves and how we label ourselves. And I think it's really interesting that in recent years, especially, I mean, I think we could all agree that the number of ways that people are choosing to label themselves has quadrupled at least. As people are really delving in and realizing that the standard definitions of self are just not sufficient to cover what we actually are. Like, we are hardly the same person today that we were when we were 10 years old or 5 years old or even 20 years old. We're not even the same person today that we were yesterday. As we take in input, that definition and all the choices and selections that we make change and fluctuate. As we begin to think about non-physical reality self, non-physically focused points of self, I think the first and easiest place to jump in, which a lot of people overlook or write off completely, is to look at there are two non-physically focused self-focus points that we're already, all of us, super familiar with. And the first one is the self that you are in your imagination. This is hardly ever looked at as being an important factor, and yet I think how we imagine ourselves is very critical. And I don't know anybody who, I mean, if you disagree, you can let me know, but I think we are very different people in our imaginations than we are in reality. Like, in my imagination, I'm some sort of combination of Beyonce and She-Ra with a Pegasus and everything. So who we are in reality versus who we are in our imaginary self can be very different. Another one that we are familiar with and experience all the time is our dream reality self. I hope I'm not like exposing too much information about myself here to say that I am a very different person in a dream state than I am out in the world in physical reality. There's far fewer inhibitions, right? In a dream state, we're also a very different version of self than we are physically or even in our imaginations. So those are two non-physical reality selves that we're all already intimately familiar with. Now, as we start to visualize this, think about the body, the human body, as a complex compound consciousness structure. It is the most fantastical creation of vibrational engineering out there. It is the state of the art, top of the line virtual reality system that interacts with you and your consciousness on such a finite degree that so many of the processes are just not even operating at a conscious level, allowing you as a consciousness to interact with other vibrations in a tangible physical manner in real time. It's astonishing. And as we start to talk about taking off that VR headwear and stepping back into the self, the structure of consciousness that lays beyond that, you can think of it as like it's like the Matrix, but please eliminate all of the nefarious alien plots or whatever. Um, if you sit still, you can stay. Yes, thank you. I love you. Now, as we begin to talk about inner layers of self, I'm going to start to use an analogy because I think it's the easiest way to sort of visualize and follow along to try and put some sort of an order to inner knowing. It can be difficult to talk about things that are such vague concepts that society at large or society in general don't even have like a common language for how we talk about it. So I'm going to use my personal analogy or visualization for that, and hopefully it helps to follow along. To sort of begin this analogy or visualization, imagine yourself taking a big step back from this physical reality. This is sort of like the first state people reach in like a meditative practice that they call detachment. So we're going to just leave the whole physical body, the physical sphere behind and imagine yourself taking a big step backwards. And when you open your eyes, what you can see is that really you are standing in an apartment. And what you've been doing is looking out the window at physical reality or through a periscope, but you're actually standing inside an apartment. And within this apartment, you're facing the window or facing into physical reality, and you have attached to yourself, or really, you are an extension of a secondary self that is sort of conjoined back to back with you. So this self is facing inward at the apartment rather than outward at the window. And what this self is what people often call intuition or inner voice. It's the master of communicating between you and all of the rest of inner non-physical knowing. Now, if we take another big step backwards and blend with this inner self, we can now open our eyes and see the rest of the apartment complex. We are now facing inward. And the first sort of focus point that we get to is the apartment itself, the walls and the ceiling and the floors. If we sort of dissolve into the space itself, what we get is everything encompassing our current physical self experience. And so when we're reaching for the causes of blockages in our lives, the causes of maladies when we're doing inner child work. This sort of first apartment sphere is where all of those kinds of connections can be examined from a broader perspective and those associations made. So inner self can take a look at that and translate it back to us again through intuitions, sometimes working with us in dreams or visions as well, to give us the pertinent information we need from the current life experience. If we take an even broader look at it, the apartment of current self is hardly isolated. All of those walls are all connected to all of the other apartments on that floor, the horizontal plane, if you will. And that entire floor of the apartment complex all have alternative versions of current self. Every choice you didn't make and where that led to, all of the potential choices that you could make and where they go. I sometimes like to think of it as the field of probabilities. This is where all of current self, which includes all of the variations of self that you could have been or might still be, are playing themselves out all exponentially on the same floor of the apartment building. Now, when we're looking to do something like reality shifting, this is sort of the field that inner self is reaching for information in. This is where we get nudges and whispers, who to go talk to, where should we be, turn right instead of left. Inner self knows where you're trying to go and what kind of experiences you're trying to have in your life, and it can reach into this horizontal plane, the field of probabilities, to nudge you into the right directions to lead you where you want to go. I think a lot of people tend to think of reality shifting as some big event or something that they're going to notice happening, but the truth of the matter is that we apartment hop through this plane all the time. Every time we make a choice that leads somewhere, we're actually hopping apartments. And even if you were to make what from your perspective would seem like a big jump into completely different choices that you would have made, the experience is going to feel seamless to you because you're jumping into that new apartment, and that new apartment actually has all of the walls and ceiling and floors, the current life experience of that apartment. So the experience in most cases is going to seem completely seamless to your perspective as a physically focused human. I have heard of cases where people have memories of something completely different from their lives so that their new life feels strange or not integrated all the way. You also get little overlaps and like deja vu, little places where the experiences overlap and you go, I know I've done this before. I remember how it went before when this happened. So you do get the little overlaps that kind of tip you off to that, but the reality shifting all happens with the apartment hopping on that horizontal plane, and it happens a lot more frequently than I think people realize. Now, if we shift once again, pull back to an even broader perspective, we can begin to see the floors above and below us, the vertical plane of the apartment building. And on all of the floors above and below us, what we start to get is other incarnations of self, other life experiences of totally different selves. And this is usually referred to as past lives or future lives. And I don't want to, the nature of time would be a whole different video, but in brief, there is a progression of the expansion of self. But from this vantage point inward, consciousness does not necessarily have to experience it in a linear fashion. So all of self incarnation is experienceable as a present moment, as a now moment, as opposed to actually being in the past or in the future. And from these different floors above and below us, all of those incarnations also have their own floors with all of their potential selves playing themselves out. And this information is all accessible from the focus point of inner self, and sometimes is. We do sometimes get pieces or flashes of other incarnations in dreams or visions. Sometimes we can reach in and pull out a skill or something that we need for our current experience. And it also sometimes happens that after experiencing a trauma, either a deep emotional trauma or a physical trauma like a head wound, sometimes when people come back around, they come out with severe personality changes, behaviors, inclinations, or abilities even that they didn't have before. Sometimes this happens after like a near death experience as well. And that's all pulling things from other incarnations of self experience. It's interesting. A lot of our creative or interest impulses can also be tied to or come from this field of other incarnations. So if you find yourself drawn to historical dramas or fascinated by something medieval or writing sci-fi, imagining things, or even interested in writing historical papers, sometimes we find that we're drawn to creatively experiences that we've had in other lifetimes. Now, if we pull ourselves all the way back and encompass the consciousness or the self-focus point of the apartment building itself, the whole apartment building, this is sort of the focus point. I think a lot of times we refer to it as higher self. We have a focus point of consciousness that really has its tendrils in all of the experiences happening within the building and experiencing them like so many nerve endings. And even that higher self perspective, the apartment building, is actually in an apartment complex of many multiple other buildings. And from that point of focus, able to reach into its fellow buildings in the same apartment complex. The way that sort of expands and works is just like you are the current physical self focus in the apartment, in a part of this apartment building, you are also building your own apartment building. Remember when I said imagination is so much more crucial than we tend to think of it? You are on some level building whole other worlds and whole other versions of self and whole other tendrils of experience. And while physically focused, we do have our blinders up so we can remain hyper focused in physical reality that's spurring all of this imagination and all of this creation. On some level, you are also your own apartment building. And all of the you that's on the same floor as you, they are all their own building too. And that's what the apartment complex is. So you are both the experience within the apartment building of higher self, but you are also creating your own building where you are higher self. Consciousness expands and expands and expands on itself at an unimaginable rate. Self is really the definition of infinity because every self focus point that's created just and creates more self. The expansion of all that is just continues to grow and multiply. Really, if we pull the perspective all the way back to the broadest perspective possible, what we get is the consciousness of source energy, the perspective of all that is. And this is, I think, sort of where we get concepts like all is one and one is all, or that we're all extensions of the same consciousness, because on the broadest perspective possible, that is really what's going on. Once again, this is just my analogy or my visualization to help me sort out and think about it for myself. It's sort of a difficult thing to contemplate on those terms if you don't have some sort of framework for it. So this is just the one I made up for myself. Hopefully it was helpful for you to listen along to it. And I think that there's benefit in thinking about self on a broader perspective. For me, it helps me realize that probably some of what I think is a big crucial factor or a big crucial disappointment or anything that I'm stressed or worried over is probably not as big a deal ultimately as I'm making it. If I feel disappointed in a choice that I made, I know that there's some version of myself out there that made a different choice. That really there's value and benefit in all of it as it contributes to all that is. So for me, I think it helps me to let go of thinking everything that I do is like super critical and relax into the experience of just enjoying physical reality for what it is. I also think it can be helpful to realize that all people have the same connections, the same intuitions, the same psychic abilities as all other people do. It's just a question of shifting your focus point. I don't think that there's any real barriers between physical self and the rest of self. It's just a question of realizing it's there and shifting your focus point to let some of the intuitions and visions and guidances come through. So I think it's useful to know and to realize that all people have the exact same sorts of psychic abilities. It's all accessible there for anybody, anytime. But I know there are a lot of different ways that people can look at it. So it all depends on what feels right and feels vibrationally accurate to you. I hope the discussion was interesting for you, at least, that you were able to kind of take a look at it and see if it passes your vibe check. If you have thoughts about self and you want to drop me a comment, let me know. I'm always happy to hear it. And check back with me because we'll be uploading more videos talking about different types of spiritual concepts and seeing if they pass the vibe check. Thanks.